Hello everyone, and welcome back to Bigfoot Lake. I hope you're ready for some Bigfoot encounters, because that's what we have tonight. So grab your favorite beverage, whether that be a nice cold ale of your choice or maybe a hot cocoa on this cold winter night. Pick your beverage of choice and let's kick back and hear some stories of Bigfoot encounters. Our first encounter comes from Warren County, New York. This was from the fall of 1989, so it's been a few years ago. The encounter starts, so this was at Butler Pond. It says, I was deer hunting with 5 people, including my younger brother. We were in our late teens. We started at sunup. The rest of my group went into the woods at a different location. I walked down the dirt road to the city water reservoir. As I made it to the pond, I could see something extremely tall with a large body mass standing at the opposite end of the pond. I remember that my immediate impression was a black bear standing up. I didn't have a scope on my rifle and no binoculars. When I observed it walking and not going down on all fours, I became a little scared. Then I gathered my courage, since I did have a deer rifle, and I walked around the pond. When I got to that area, I found no tracks in the mud or no tracks in the trail surrounding. I know what I saw, and I decided to keep it to myself. I was thinking Bigfoot. Around 1 o'clock, we all met back at my car. I met my younger brother first. He had told me that he was standing against my car when Bigfoot came from the woods and went up across the road and back up the opposite hill. He described the Bigfoot coming from the direction where I'd observed it. I told him to keep his mouth shut for fear people would think he was nuts. Long story short, years later, I asked him about what he'd seen. He was serious when he said his impression was Bigfoot, and he had no other explanation. It was then that I broke down and told him what I had seen. He said nothing more, and neither of us has spoken of it again. So this encounter at Butler Pond in Warren County, that's actually a very heavily forested area on part of the Adirondack Mountains. I don't even believe this area is accessible anymore. They've kind of closed the area off, so it's very remote, and there have been many reports from this area, including a report just 3 or 4 years ago of tracks that were found in one of the backyards that were adjacent to this mountain leading up to the Butler Pond area. The tracks were so significant that they called in an expert, and the expert came in and took plaster casts of these Bigfoot tracks. They were absolutely massive. I've seen these castings, and these are probably the biggest castings I've seen personally. So this is a great encounter from this is upstate New York, Warren County, on an area that's known as West Mountain, that Butler Pond area. So if you're familiar with that area and you know any other stories or encounters from that area, I'd love to hear from you and pick up some more information to go along with this. So that was a great report from some hunters. So our next report, we move to Putnam County, Indiana, and this was from April 25th of 2007. And all of you mushroom hunters out there from morels, you'll understand this story. It says a couple were mushroom hunting along Big Walnut Creek in western Indiana. The two had separated to cover a bigger area in the forest looking for morel mushrooms. In Indiana, these are a gourmet delicacy and are sold for $20 to $30 per pound. The man was finding several remains of mushrooms that had already been picked, and he had decided that other mushroom hunters had already been there and already picked the area. His wife was finding the same thing, and she was losing interest in finding any mushrooms. She had decided that the mushrooms that had already been picked had been done so very recently. Then she spotted a very small one that apparently had been missed by the earlier hunters. When she bent over to pick it, she could hear a breathing sound. When she looked up, she could see a man. He was about 50 feet away, and this man was staring at her. As she looked closer, she could see that this was no man, but as she described it, as a man/ape, covered in blackish brown hair, about 7 feet tall, standing next to a tree, and was completely still, motionless. The more she looked, it became like a statue, completely motionless. She looked in the direction of where she thought her husband was, and then when she looked back to where this creature was standing, it was still there, except now it was completely behind the tree. All she could see was its shoulder. It was being very still. She yelled and started running through the forest in the direction of where they had parked their truck. Her husband hollered back, and he set out to find what was wrong. When he found her, she was back at the truck, shaking uncontrollably. She told him what she saw, and he remarked that he kept hearing something following him, and he thought that it was his wife. And now he realized that she had been looking for mushrooms in the opposite direction of where he was hearing the footsteps and the low vocal-like chatter. So that's indeed an interesting encounter in Putnam County, Indiana. And I know many of you who listen are familiar with hunting for morel mushrooms, and they're like the treasure of the forest. So you're focused on finding these mushrooms on the ground, and sometimes you kind of don't pay attention too much to the surrounding hills and the surrounding valleys, for you're being focused for these treasures on the ground. And that kind of seems like that was the case here, as the wife finally spotted a mushroom that hadn't been picked and was a bit distracted. And when she looked up, that was, as she described it, a man/ape covered in blackish brown hair, about 7 feet tall, standing next to a tree, motionless. And you know, there's a lot of discussion of Bigfoot and how it can blend in with things and hide very well. This kind of fits along with that description. This how it froze and didn't move, and if you hadn't noticed it before, maybe you wouldn't even have seen it. So just another example of Bigfoot blending in with his surroundings. And I can just picture this woman shaking and trembling in fear. So that was a great report from Putnam County, Indiana. So if you have any information from that area, or maybe you're from that area, I'd love to hear some thoughts of this story, and have you seen anything similar to this? So with that, let's move on to our next encounter. Our next story actually comes from Flynn Springs in San Diego County in California. And this goes all the way back to 1951. So this story's got some age to it. So let's begin with our story. It says, I was very young, so my story was never taken as anything more than a child's tall tale. I lived in a small house in an area of mostly chicken farms and large groves of citrus trees. It was in the county of San Diego, California. There was nothing but open land and rocky foothills. The hills were rugged, with thick brush and scrub oaks. The town was called Flynn Springs, and the town consisted of one small county store, all the way back in 1951. Where this happened was a chicken ranch. The few houses around were all on at least an acre of ground. The chicken ranch was right across from our house, a dirt road separating the two. Beyond the chicken ranch was a sage-covered field, and then next came a large citrus grove, mainly lemons. There were pomegranate trees planted on the edge of the lemon grove. Beehives were placed in the grove and in the sage field next to it. Beyond the grove were rocky hills that stretched to the Cuyamaca Mountains and then to Mount Laguna. There were no houses that I knew of between the grove and the mountains, with the exception of the Viejas Indian Reservation outside the community, Alpine, on the south side of what's now known as Old Highway 80. It runs parallel to the Interstate Highway 8 that runs east-west. It was 1951, and I spent the day watching George, the egg rancher guy, butcher a cow. There was a lot of blood, and they buried the hide, the head, the hoofs, and intestines in a shallow hole they had dug under a large oak. That night we were playing hide-and-go-seek, and I hid in a brush pile just south, a few feet from where they had dug that pit. I laid there, and I heard footsteps, and it sounded like a person wearing flip-flops. I'll never forget that sound. I lay very still, thinking it was one of the hide-and-go-seek players looking for me. I heard a low groan and some sniffing-like sounds, and the steps came closer to the brush pile. I was starting to get scared, but afraid to try and run. Now, I didn't smell anything like reported at other sightings, but I was lying in a pile of decaying brush, weeds, and grass, and it was a smelly chicken ranch anyway. I pushed myself deeper into the brush pile, trying to get away from whatever seemed to be stalking me. This wasn't the brightest move because it gave my position away. A kind of leap, and then I saw the face. I'll never forget. 3 feet in front of me in the opening of the cave I had made in the brush pile, a face appeared. It was large with dark brown reddish hair, a broad flat nose. It had light brown skin tone and jet black eyes, but looked gold when the moonlight hit them. There was little or no hair on the upper part of the face, and more human-looking than ape. Its mouth was open a bit, and I could see his yellow teeth. 2 of the front ones were larger than the others, and 2 were larger than human eye teeth, but smaller than a dog's or bear's canine teeth, and not as pointed. His expression was almost one of confusion. I wanted to scream, but couldn't, as it looked at me. He lifted some of the brush with one massive hand to get a better look. It seemed like forever, and I remember being petrified. I heard my brother calling and my dog Rayona barking. It gently set the brush back into place and stood up. I could see its body now. He was massive, covered with long strands of dark reddish-brown hair, and it had huge long arms. I have no idea of its height, but he was much taller than my 6-foot father. After a minute, it bends back down and stares at me again, but makes no move to hurt me or try to pull me out of my hiding place. He simply takes a deep sighing groan and left. I heard 3 or 4 loud thumps heading off towards the grove of the citrus. I crawled out from my hiding place as soon as I thought it was safe and ran screaming home. Neither my brother nor none of his friends could calm me down. My mom came running, and I blurted out my story, but no one would believe me. My mother accused my brother and the neighbor boys of telling me scary stories. I was hysterical, and it took days for me to calm down. And to this day, I still see that face. It was a full moon night, and a starlit. It was starlit. I saw the beast plainly, and he walked on 2 feet. I don't know if he was there because of the buried cow parts, or he was just curious of this little guy, me, playing. He made no attempt to dig up the butchered remains, nor made any attempt to harm me. There were several fruit trees spread out on the ranch and the homes nearby. Apricot, plum, and pomegranate trees were everywhere, and I think that's what he came out of the hills for. I stopped playing hide-and-go-seek at night and never went out to that brush pile again. I thought I saw him 2 other times in between the chicken coops. It was a large form looking in the cages and eating the grain or looking for eggs. I never mentioned it again to anyone, but I thought you might want to decide if I dreamed it or not. If it was a dream, it stayed with me for 57 years, and it's just as real today as it was in the summer of 1951. What an amazing encounter. And that's something we see a lot of also when we have young witnesses. So often their story is just disregarded. So what do you think about this encounter in Flynn Springs, San Diego County, California? If you have any information of any other stories from this area, or you're from this area, I'd really like to hear from you, so leave a comment, and see if we could follow up with some more information on this, not only this area, but this particular encounter. So that was an amazing encounter. So next, we move to the state of Oklahoma. This was at the Holson Valley State Game Management Area in Leflore County, Oklahoma. That's a mouthful. It says, I'm a former state prosecutor, former Marine, 18-year marriage, 2 kids. I'm just a boring family guy. In late March of 2006, I went camping in dense pine forests in the area of the Goldville Divide, south of Snake Mountain, in the Holson Valley State Game Management Area of the Winding Stair Mountain Recreation Area. This was in southeast Oklahoma. I picked this area because it was the only area in Oklahoma I could find that wasn't subject to a burn ban at the time. My sons went with me. I had no idea that this hill country in southeast Oklahoma had long been the subject of Bigfoot stories. And my sons, 12 and 9, and I were in some of the deepest parts of it. It was remote, it was primitive, and we thought we were all alone. Long story short, after dark, we were exposed to the most unusual calls from the surrounding hills. During the night, we received a visit from a very large biped. Both my 9-year-old son and I awoke to crunching footsteps and saw a hulking shadow standing just outside our tent, about 2 feet taller than my Nissan Pathfinder. I was very well armed, and I have some hunting and combat experience, but I was so unbelievably frightened by the sheer mass of this creature that I didn't move. Eventually, it left. In early April of 2007, we went back. We had pretty much decided to dismiss our late night encounter, but we went back to the same exact site. I really didn't expect anything. Within 5 minutes of arrival, before I even pitched a tent, very, very deep, apish grunts sounded from the dense woods about 25 feet from our truck. I've heard pig grunts, bear grunts, and etc. This was not that. My sons and I laughed at the strangeness of it. I actually mimicked the grunts, and the animal grunted and huffed back at me. While we couldn't see the critter, it sounded for all the world like a gorilla. Then the animal stomped and huffed and rushed away through the woods. Couldn't see it, but it was real interesting. That night, the whistles, the whoops, and the grunts went around the campsite all night. The strangest thing is that I wasn't afraid this time. So, I realized that my story proves nothing, but as one old goat to a younger one, let me just say this: be alert, be analytical, but don't let the bastards wear you down in spirit. There just may be a few dragons left in this old world. So I thought that was a pretty amazing encounter of this father and his sons. Actually, 2 encounters. Lots of those typical grunts and the whoops and the whistles reported that are associated with so many Bigfoot encounters. So if you are familiar with this area, southeast Oklahoma, I guess he's calling it the Hill Country, I'd love to hear from you. Do you have any reports or have heard anything along these lines of Bigfoot encounters or strange encounters in this area? Yeah, please reach out. We would love to share the stories here at Bigfoot Lake for everybody to hear. Another great encounter. So the next encounter, we actually moved to the state of Ohio, and this is actually considered a grassman encounter, but I thought I would include it anyway. And this was from Morgan County, Ohio. This is on the 4th of July, 2012. The encounter goes: my husband and I just spent July 3rd through the 7th camping in southeastern Ohio at a private lake, which we prefer not to name. On the night of July 4th, around 11:30 p.m., we were on the private lake, which borders the west side of a stretch of power lines. One of our friends in a kayak smelled a strong musk skunk odor from the west side of the lake. The wind was blowing to the east. At the same time, we heard crashing branches, like something running through the woods over on the east side of camp, on the other side of those power lines. She brought the kayak back to shore, and then her boyfriend took the kayak out to the deepest end of the lake. All of a sudden, a huge rock, about the size of a full-grown German shepherd, flew across the road, which runs all the way around the lake, over the bank, over the grass line, and into the lake. This was approximately 20 yards from the kayak. Then our friend in the kayak antagonized it, really just trying to scare it away by pounding his paddle on his kayak and yelling, "Hey, you big ape!" Then the grass man threw a second rock, even bigger than the first. It landed a lot closer, within 10 yards of his kayak. The 3 of us on the bank were approximately 100 yards from this creature, and our friend in the kayak was about 30 yards. We all saw the creature. He was peeking out from behind a tree. He rocked his body back and forth from one side of the tree to the other. Then he moved to the water line and back. At that point, my husband set off 3 bottle rockets, thinking it would scare the grass man off. He then loaded his 12-gauge shotgun. He didn't want to harm or make it mad. He just didn't want it to get any closer. The creature seemed to stand about 4.5 to 5 feet tall, with no neck. He may have been a juvenile or he was crouching down. He looked very thick in the chest, thick torso, broad shoulders, and glowing dark yellow eyes. He was light to medium brown, the color of the tree bark. We had our really bright mag light with new batteries pointing right at him. We thought we heard another one just south of us, possibly calling the creature with a whoop sound. Then our grass man disappeared to the south. We think there were 2 adults around the outside of the camp, and what we encountered was a juvenile. We were all so excited from our encounter that we stayed up until about daylight. The whole time we were there, before and after the encounter, we heard a baby crying, a woman screaming, and even heavy breathing at different times. My husband also heard strange whistles, whooping sounds, and even a tree fell over in the woods on the other side of the lake. We all heard that. In years past, at this same camp, we've heard things and smelled things, but never had the encounter we had this year. What a rush! My husband believes they used the power lines as a trail. We believe truly there was more than one grass man around our camp this year. It was a full moon that night, so he possibly could have been a darker color, but his hair was shiny from the moon glow and the flashlight. This is true to the best of our account. It's changed the way we think about going into the woods for the rest of our lives. That is an amazing encounter from Morgan County, Ohio. Now, this area, southeastern Ohio, that's where I was born and raised. I grew up not too far from this in Perry County, and this whole entire region of southeastern Ohio is very heavily forested. And there's actually been recent encounters of even horses being attacked by something that they couldn't identify, and that's been within the last month or so. So if you have any information for reports or encounters from this Morgan County area or in southeastern Ohio in general, again, we'd love to hear from you. Yeah, so reach out if you have any more to add to the southeast Ohio lore, 'cause there's a lot of reports coming from that area. So now we move on to our last encounter of the night, and this one's actually from the state of Maine. And the encounter begins, I have a story for you from the state of Maine. This event took place about 10 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. My father and I were fishing for brook trout in the northern Maine woods. In 1988, I would have been around 13 years old at the time, and my father was 38. It was a beautiful early summer day, and the fish were biting. This particular area of the Maine woods is extremely thick and dark. Almost gives you a feeling that someone or something is watching you. We were wading down the brook when we noticed the half-eaten remains of a snowshoe hare, it's a rabbit, lying on the bank of the brook. On closer examination, we noticed that the head of the hare was half-eaten. My father did not think too much of this since he's an avid outdoorsman and has seen nature at work before, but myself, a young boy, was amazed at this sight, and after poking and prodding at the remains with a stick, I moved on down the brook. We also noticed that the water in the brook had been disturbed, and since the water was moving slowly, that it happened recently. Even I noticed this at my young age, but we both didn't think much of it until later that night when we recapped the amazing day. Anyway, back to the story. We had caught our limit of brook trout that day and were heading back to the truck, which was parked about 5 miles away at the end of a logging road. This is the road we followed on the way out. When I say logging road, I mean an old logging road which has not been logged in over 30 years and was very grown over, but made for easier walking than through the thick cedars. We didn't talk much on the way down the road until we came across an old cabin deep in the woods. We stopped to sit down for a while and rest. We noticed a logbook on the table, and we read it, and throughout the book were entries about the owners of the cabin seeing the Ridge Monster, as they called it, and they gave details about the creature, which now matches ours. Rested, we walked on down the trail when all of a sudden my father stopped dead in his tracks. I figured he was taking another break, so I stopped and examined some flowers on the ground. When I looked at my father, I saw a face on him that I had never seen before and hoped to never see again. He was looking towards a small opening in the forest for perhaps 15 to 20 seconds. I became concerned and asked him what he was looking at. Since female moose have their young this time of year and are usually very protective, we had seen plenty that day, when he suddenly grabbed me and told me to hurry. My father was very uneasy. We made the 5-mile trip out and back to the truck in record time. While I still had no idea why my father was in such a hurry, and it was hard for me to keep up with him since I was so small and he is a man over 6 feet tall. When we got back to the truck, he told me to get in with a tone of voice that I dared not disobey. On the ride home, he told me the incredible story of what he had seen. At the time we rounded a small corner in the trail, my father had caught movement out of the corner of his eye. When he looked up, he saw what could have only been and was a Bigfoot, the Maine Ridge Monster. My father described the creature as being at least 8 feet tall and estimates it weighing over 500 pounds. The creature had one long arm grasping a tree and 1 foot up on an incline in the forest floor, and remained there staring at my father and I for about 15 to 20 seconds. My father said it seemed to be bored with us all of a sudden and simply pulled itself up with the one hand grasping the tree and silently disappeared into the woods. My father, through sheer terror for my sake and to maintain his sanity, never told me until we got to the truck. Imagine what I would have thought when he told me a 500-pound mythical creature was within 20 yards of me. I never saw the creature, only my father did, and he was amazed not only at the incredible sight itself, but the agility and the stealth of it. My father and I both concluded that we startled the creature feeding on the hare down by the brook's shore. It followed us throughout the day out of curiosity while keeping its distance. When I think about all the stories I've heard over the years and how a smell accompanies the creature, I did notice a strange smell when we stopped on the trail, but that could have been the smell of a cedar swamp spring. The brook has no name where we were fishing. It was early summer to late spring 1988 at about 10 a.m. I don't remember the direction of the wind, but the prevailing winds usually blow northeast. I did notice a faint smell, but not as strong as some I have read about. The most significant thing one remembers of the creature was the huge size and the silence it possessed in its movement. My father believes it was a male, since there were no breasts. The creature appeared to be in good health, was fast, and was strong. We have heard Maine Indian stories of a gentle giant, as they call it, that has lived in the Maine woods since the Indians first settled there, and many sightings have been made in modern times. My father is a well-respected man in our community and has never told anyone outside of our family, and plans to keep it that way in order to protect the animal from pursuit. What an amazing encounter from this state of Maine. So are any of you from Maine, or have you traveled there and been through the forest in Maine and experienced something that was similar to this, or what we would consider extraordinary? If so, reach out to us. We would love to hear from you. So that is our stories for tonight. That was 6 total stories we told tonight, and I hope you enjoyed each and every one of them. And again, if you have a story you'd like to share, just send us an email, bigfootprepper@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to share your story here. We can keep it anonymous, or however you would prefer. So definitely reach out. So appreciate each and every one of you being here tonight for our stories. Appreciate being able to gather here at Bigfoot Lake with each and every one of you. So we hope you have a great night, and we'll see all of you on the next.